Hello, everyone. Welcome and good evening, late afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with Sathnam Sanghera, who is here with his new book, Empireland: How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain. He'll be in conversation with Hitesh Hathi. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our digital community. Thank you for joining us tonight. In support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore, we sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Our spring event season is just charging along with many in-person and virtual events. You can see what's coming up on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our shelves from home. After the introduction, I will drop a link in the chat to order Empireland. Your purchases make this virtual event series possible, and now more than ever, support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. This evening's event will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk, you can go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. The event also has closed captioning available, and depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you might need to enable it yourself by clicking on the closed caption live transcript button. That's also at the bottom of your screen. And finally, as you might have experienced in virtual gatherings over the past couple of years, technical issues might arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you for your patience and understanding. Sathnam Sanghera is the author of the novel Marriage Material and the memoir, The Boy with the Top Knot, which was shortlisted for the Costa Biography Award and the Penn Ackerley Prize. He's a graduate of Christ College, Cambridge, a columnist and writer at the Times, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. He'll be speaking today with Hitesh Hathi, the executive director of the Lakshmi, Mittal, and Family South Asia Institute at Harvard University. Hathi worked as a producer at WBUR for over 20 years, in particular as an executive producer on the acclaimed programs Here and Now and Radio Boston. It was once said and quoted many times over that at its height, the sun never set on the British Empire. The modern world may like to think that we've left all that behind, but the truth is that the knock-on effects of empire, colonialism, and exploitation, of exporting a particular set of values and ideas are still making waves today. This book has been receiving rave reviews, including from The Guardian, which said in part, "It's an impassioned and deeply personal journey through Britain's imperial past and present. Without getting bogged down in definitions, calculations, or complicated comparisons, Empireland manages to convey something of the sheer variety of imperial experiences over 4 centuries and the limits of broad brush explanations." And in a starred review from Kirkus says, "The sun may have set on the British Empire, but this piercing examination of its legacies is thoroughly timely." And so now I am thoroughly pleased to turn things over to tonight's speakers. The digital podium is yours, Sathnam and Hitesh.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claire. I want to say you were very generous in your introduction to me. I was not the executive producer of both of those programs, but that's a small technical detail, so let's not get bothered with that. Thank you. And I have to say, I'm delighted to be here with Sathnam, and I'm actually very delighted to be here as part of a Harvard Bookstore event. It's worth saying at the very top that institutions make places great, and Harvard Bookstore is one of the great institutions in this city and region that has helped sustain a vibrant life for all of us. So thank you for hosting us. And Sathnam, I'm just delighted to be here with you in conversation. And I'm remarking as I was reading through the book, which I couldn't put down, and in the end raced through it until I would fall asleep and then pick it back up again, that it actually comes at a very extraordinary moment. An Overton window sort of has shifted, where a certain set of discussions about difficult issues, whether they're about race or gender or history, are possible now. And somehow maybe it's a moment where we can examine the colonial history of England especially, but of all of Europe, in a different and slightly perhaps more honest way. I don't know, was that part of your thinking as you were putting it together? The research clearly goes back for a long time, but as you were writing it in the last phase.
Yeah, I've got to say, I'm reluctant to talk because you've got such a nice voice. I could listen to you all night, and it's late evening here. So, it's the kind of voice I want to listen to as I fall asleep, but I'm not going to fall asleep. And that's a good question. I mean, it's one of those books that was accidentally timely, to be honest. When I started writing it, my friends didn't really understand what I was trying to do. I remember doing a reading and then being confused about whether it was a history book, and I'm not an historian, whether it was a memoir, why was I writing a memoir again, because I've written one before. They were totally confused. But then Black Lives Matter happened. And I remember I was towards the end of my writing the book, and I put on the news. It was during the pandemic, and there was an item leading the BBC News about how the racism in America had been caused in part by the racism of British Empire. And it was such a weird feeling seeing like the things I've been thinking about for years. Suddenly it was like the biggest story in the world.
Yes.
Right? Colonialism is now, it's one of the hot subjects, isn't it? You pick up any newspaper in Britain, probably in America too, every day there's 3 or 4 stories that are related to colonialism or race or systemic racism or the issues I cover in the book, but completely accidental and wasn't my intention. Actually, the book began, I was originally intending to write a biography of a guy, the first Indian who emigrated to Britain, a guy called Dean Mohammed. Yes. And I was just trying to find out about what Britain might have been like at the time. And that's when I realized I knew nothing about British Empire. So I started researching it, which became the book.
And, we should get to that in a little bit, which is that the Britain you found from a few hundred years ago was also a much more extraordinarily complex place than we imagine today, in terms of the population and the cultures that were floating around there. There was early on in the book, perhaps in the first or second chapter, there was a small little bit that just absolutely intrigued me. And I thought, you've invented a little bit of a new genre, which is memoir, history, and journalism all together. And I think we have to find a name for this genre. I've been thinking about it. But one of the things you talked about is your own visits as a child to the Punjab in India from Britain as a British Asian child. And when you were there as a child, your Punjabi was not terribly good. And then you go back as an adult and your Punjabi is not terribly good.
It's even worse.
In fact, you said I think your line was, it's grown ropier than before. A nice Britishism, which we in America should appreciate. And I was struck by that. And in the end, as I was thinking about it, it was so nicely done because it somehow connects to the theme of the book or your exploration. I know as someone who has migrated and from a family that's migrated, often there's embarrassment about not knowing one's quote unquote native language, though which one is one's native language gets complicated too. But you were not embarrassed. You're absolutely fine to say, well, it had gotten worse in the meantime, and this is how it is. And your book itself becomes an examination of both how you and your family and your own history was formed, but how the history of this modern world, and especially Britain, was formed and how you became a part of it. So you're absolutely comfortable in this complicated inheritance you have. And this is an exploration of its true complexity with parts that perhaps we haven't thought about in a while. Is that a fair?
Yeah, that's very kind. But I think you're right. And again, I think it's accidental. I think it's because I wrote a memoir quite early on in my life in writing terms. I wrote my memoir when I was around 30. And since then, I'm a journalist on the Times. A lot of the stuff I get asked to do is often from my memoir, kind of my family's experience, my own experience. And I used to resist it. I used to think I'd slightly failed, that everything was so solipsistic. But I actually realized with the memoir, because the memoir is about many things, but it's also about my father and my sister having schizophrenia, which is a very difficult subject to talk about. But I realized if you talk about yourself and if you make it funny, people read it. I think people pick up a book about schizophrenia they would normally wouldn't pick up. And I think it's useful also for a subject like British Empire, which is also quite difficult and definitely as complicated as schizophrenia. And so I think hopefully by writing it from a personal perspective, you bring people in. And as someone who didn't until recently read a lot of history books, I think a lot of the problem with a lot of history books is that they're written for people who read history books or for other historians. They assume a lot of knowledge, and hopefully this is a book for people who wouldn't normally read a history book. And I think there's a market for that. And I think historians are sometimes too focused on writing for one another.
It is, you know what, I have to tell you, it is both a history book and journalism, and it is a memoir. I really think we have to invent a term for what it is. I'd like to get into some of what the book covers, but before I do that, I want to tell people who are listening, first of all, thank you. It's very nice to have all of you here, especially on a Friday evening. And we are going to get to questions. There's a chat function at the bottom of your screen. If you put down questions there, we'll be happy to get to them. And Sathnam, I just want to give listeners a kind of overview for a minute. And maybe what I'd love for you to do is to talk about your process, how you kind of got into the book. But the thing that strikes me most about the book, and the thing that people don't often think about, is we think of empire, or many people think of empire, as something that, say, British or French people went and did over there. And yours is an attempt to really look at also what it did to Britain, you know, and how it transformed the imperial society as much as anything else. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, it is. And I think it's probably something hard for people in America to understand, because I think people outside Britain find it very easy to see Britain through the prism of empire, because that's been their experience of Britain, in that Britain conquered a quarter of the planet, and most of those countries remember what happened, whereas the British don't, because it didn't really happen. Well, it didn't happen on our shores. So we never had that dark night of the soul like the French did, you know, after World War II, and Germans after World War II. They never had to think about what they did. It ended, and we almost acted like it never happened. And we destroyed a lot of evidence. I mean, there was Operation Legacy, where we burnt a lot of the documents. It was said that there was so much burning going on around the time of partition that there was a pool of smoke permanently over New Delhi. But yeah, all of this together, and combined with the fact we then came up with this idea of the Commonwealth, which isn't really an organization that stands for anything, it all helped us act as if empire never happened. So people haven't really examined about what it's done for us. And my argument in this book is that actually it shaped us in loads of ways. It explains our wealth, our multiculturalism. The reason I'm here is because of empire. The reason you're there in a very complicated way is because of British Empire. Our racism, our multiculturalism, our politics, Brexit, the way everywhere you go in the world, there's British people. That's because of empire. The way everywhere you go, there's Indians. And that's because we sent 1 million Indians around the world as indentured laborers. That's another reason British Empire needs to be understood. Our language, our success in the world wars, you know, our businesses, so much can be explained by British Empire, and yet we don't teach it particularly well, and we don't talk about it that much.
So listen, you've alluded to some of the things I want to get to. One of them, for example, is the origins of racism, which you write about so eloquently. But talk a little bit about your own journey in exploring this topic, because it's really there. It is really woven through the book, the way you go about it. It really is your own voyage of discovery as much as your discovery of history.
Yeah, I guess, you know, in a basic way, my journey is that I went from knowing absolutely nothing to knowing too much. I mean, I supposedly had an excellent education. I went to the other Cambridge, and yet I wasn't taught anything about empire. I think the first brown person I studied was in my final term, in my final year at Cambridge. I was allowed to read Salman Rushdie, I think, for one term. So I didn't know much, and it was a shock to get to my 40s and realize I didn't know much about the biggest thing Britain had ever done. And also, it explained so much about my life, all those things I just mentioned. But also, I'm a Sikh, and a lot of the Sikh identity has been shaped by Britain, actually created by British Empire, because we're a small community in India, but we took the side of the British at the crucial mutiny of 1857. And so the British at that point decided that we were a martial race. They did this with other people too. They did it with the Highlanders of Scotland. They did it with the Hausas in Nigeria. But they decided that we were to be trusted and we should dominate the Indian army. And we did. And nowadays, you meet most Sikhs, they'll say, oh, we're a martial race. And most of us don't realize it was created by the British. And it was so successful that the numbers of Sikhs increased massively in the late 19th century. A lot of people converted to Sikhism so that they could have the respect and the sympathy of the British and be seen well by them. And I think there's very little awareness. But as a Sikh, we have a complicated relationship with empire. We were indulged by the British, but also, when necessary, we were subjugated and killed. I mean, famously at Jallianwala Bagh, the massacre of 1919, which if you watched Gandhi, the film, you will have seen depicted. And we fought in huge numbers in World War I and II. We went to East Africa, I think where your family's from, to help build the railway.
Exactly.
And then we came to Britain, where we were again indulged in some ways and then discriminated against in other ways.
So, that gets into this question of racism, because again, you look at this, what I really admire about your book is the way you look at the facts on the ground without an ideology. So as a Sikh, you're willing to look at the fact that some parts of the Sikh identity were really creations of the British Empire for the purposes of the empire. But you also have a more complicated history, so that you also point out that the Sikhs had a martial history before the British, but the British really, needed to deploy a martial race to help them in their empire. But you talk about racism, I mean, both the racism of the Sikh community, that the Sikh community suffered from, even as it was admired and being used, but also the origins of racism and the way it is part and parcel of the imperial colonial project. And there's shocking examples all through the book. I mean, absolutely shocking. Maybe I don't want to use your examples. Maybe you want to talk about some of them. The kind of almost thoughtless brutality with which different kinds of peoples were treated. So talk a little bit about the origins of racism, how it was part of this colonialist project from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, it's not controversial. Every single imperial historian I've ever read acknowledges the racism of empire, even those people who think British Empire was good. It was reflected in our involvement in transatlantic slavery, but in the kind of mundane violence of Indian life. So there were signs in hotels saying, you are kindly requested not to beat the servants. That was in the 19th century. The Sikhs, who again were massively indulged, and at one stage they're like, okay, maybe we should let them drive the trains. But then it was decided they couldn't be trusted. And actually, the top jobs in India never went to Indians. Famously, Lord Curzon said that, the reason there wasn't a single Indian in the government of India is that there wasn't a single Indian amongst 300 million Indians capable of doing the job. And that was just casual remarks all the time. And it's interesting now that in this culture we're having, some people are denying that the British Empire was racist, and it was the basis. I think Victorians would be very surprised to hear that.
Yes.
But I guess my argument in the book is that in relation to Britain, the racism that we imported, or our particular flavor of racism in Britain, comes straight from empire. I mean, at one stage, brown people were in Britain and the empire was still going on at the same time. And the same things were happening in both places. So there was the racial violence, routine, the fear of mixed race relationships, I mean, in the 1950s in Britain, there were riots, race riots. Quite often race riots around that time began when a black person or a brown person was seen with a white woman. Yes. And that similar fear of mixed race relationships existed in India, really in a profound way. Then you had the color bar, the clubs in India, famously, you weren't allowed to go to. Even if you spoke as well as you weren't allowed to go to those clubs. And similarly, when I was growing up, certain working men's clubs, certain pubs, you couldn't go to, and this was the 1980s,
Yes.
and and then you've got the wild racial stereotypes, which you hear all the time throughout British imperial history. So ideas that, Indians at one point aren't to be trusted, then they are to be trusted. Then, black people are lazy, but actually, no, Indians are now lazy. Actually, Chinese people are lazy, and this insane racial stereotypes, which we still have in Britain. At the start of my career, I remember hearing an editor tell me that he wanted to employ me because Indians work hard. But that implies that he thinks other races don't work hard.
Don't work hard, exactly.
It's all nonsense. And I think it all goes back to British Empire.
There's a concomitant kind of brutality. Give some of those examples. I mean, the ways in which, say, at the Battle of Gujarat, as you describe it, which I did not know, Sikhs were being hunted and killed by British soldiers, Afghanistan, Tibet, and again, the way large-scale killing could take place because these were just savages. Or you also have examples from Africa of British troops engaging in things that today would bring you up for, absolute violation of human rights, civilians, soldiers being killed post-capture, etc., etc. Just talk about a couple of those examples that are so brutal, and maybe also a minute about the Jallianwala Bagh incident, which really changed the course of the empire in India.
I guess the worst racial violence happened after the mutiny of 1857, because, broadly, that happened when the Indians rebelled. They killed quite a lot of white people. And there was an extreme response to that in Britain. You had people like Charles Dickens saying that, he wanted every Indian murdered, And that was the response. The British went around burning whole villages, killing families because one person they thought might be involved in it, and, sending people for life into penal colonies and so on. But yeah, Jallianwala Bagh, probably the most famous massacre. I think around 900 people killed. They were just gathered there for probably a religious event next to the Sikh holy place. There might have been a bit of political stuff going on, but they were a peaceful crowd. And General Dyer walked in with his soldiers and opened fire, and killed them. And even at the time, Winston Churchill said it was an absolute disgrace. But it says a lot about the position of the Sikhs, that we were victims, but also the soldiers during the firing, some of them were Sikhs, which really conveys our complicated position. But yeah, in terms of the violence, one of the things I just cannot forget is how it became, soldiers fighting in Africa will want to have, kind of memories and kind of things to take back, like the equivalent of a fridge magnet. And so they wanted to collect body parts to take back, human skulls. So they would actually order these skulls, they'd order heads. And then there's a description in the book of, some soldiers sitting in a cauldron, boiling these heads to get the flesh off the bone, just so they can take it back. And there were really high-level British officers involved in stuff like that. Queen Victoria heard about one of her generals doing that and said it stank too much of medieval times. So there was disgrace and shame even at the time. Yes. About some of the stuff that was going on.
I really, that example really affected me. It also showed the extent to which, it got to sort of 2 points simultaneously: the racism that allowed the empire to happen, but also the simultaneous dehumanizing of the soldiers themselves. Who except someone who has dehumanized themselves enough will boil other human beings' heads, whom they've cut, who are not perhaps even participants in the war? It wasn't even clear. Some of them, it seemed, were merely civilians. And of course, there are always complexities. So Jallianwala Bagh, as you mentioned, it was in a very tense political moment. There had been edicts against gathering. It was, as the independence, the last phase of the Indian independence movement was gathering steam. But then again, as you found out, as you were looking into it, it was even more, the massacre was more horrific than you could imagine. And doctors were being harassed as they were trying to save people. And General Dyer, as we all know, would have taken cannon in if he could, or actually
A
sort of
machine gun, I think. A tank
machine
or a
gun.
machine gun, yeah.
Machine gun if he could, but he couldn't. The alleys were too small. So larger guns in any case. But the racism question makes me turn to one of our questions here. So I'm going to read it out loud. There is not a name attached to this, but the gentleman or lady asks, can you speak at all about the similarities between the legacy of empire in England and the legacy of slavery in the US in regards to systemic racism? And, you have a preface to the book, sort of for American audiences. So I just thought that might be a good point to turn to.
Yeah, no, I've been thinking a lot about it because with the book coming out in America, and you know what? America likes to think of itself as an anti-colonial country. And I think it's a lie, because America is itself a creation of British Empire. The 13 colonies were a distinct phase of British colonialism. The Puritans were escaping religious persecution in Britain, but they were British, were English, and a lot of American culture, the judicial procedures, the political practice, the capitalism, basically British ideas. And I think sometimes Americans forget that the enslaved who ended up in America through the transatlantic slave trade, that trade was dominated by the British for large periods. And also a lot of the produce that they made ended up in Britain or in the British imperial economy. And most importantly, the white supremacy that made slavery happen, the Enlightenment thinking, that was a transatlantic thing. You can follow, leading intellectuals in Britain, Scotland, Germany, all talking to each other about why, white people are the best. And if you look, I found this amazing quote showing how, Britain's racist imperialism inspired Americans' own racist imperialism. And Theodore Roosevelt in 1899 wrote that the colonization of India has done lots for the English character. If we do as well in the Philippines and the West Indies, it will do a great deal for our character. And you see stuff like that being said all the time. And I think the War of Independence, the way I see it, was essentially a civil war between two sets of British ideals, really. And I think America ended up taking the exact path of British Empire. The settler colonialism, that happened in America was the same as the settler colonialism that happened in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. There's the same abuse of native people, the same kind of residential school systems, the same reserve confinement. And so I really think you need to understand British Empire to understand American history. But I think Americans don't really think about it, do they? They see it as something they defeated, yes, and they stand against.
You have a beautiful metaphor in there. You say America thinking it's not formed by Britain, and the British Empire is like the teenager rebelling from parents and running away from home, right?
Yeah. They're still a creation of the parents. Yes. They can run away, but yeah, they're still the creation. And I'm working on a sequel to Empireland, and it's shocking how the politicians like Roosevelt were talking to the leading politicians of South Africa, Australia, about how to keep brown people out of their countries. It was a conspiracy of white supremacy. They were consulting each other. Like one of them would pass an anti-immigrant law, and they'd be like, "Can you give me some advice on how you made that work? Because we want the same thing here." And it wasn't just about Black people. It was often about Indian immigrants and actually Chinese immigrants, of whom there were quite a few on the west coast of America and in Australia and so on. And Australia, of course, eventually was looked up to by the rest because it became, a white state.
Exactly.
A white Australia policy, right?
Yes. There are a few things, I'm sorry, there are 2 or 3 questions I want to ask there. But what's most interesting to me is one of the historical facts that you talk about in the book, and you you're so well read, you have your sources, talks about the reality that the empire was, and we live in an age of conspiracy theories. The empire was not a planned thing. It was a series of accidents, a series of disparate decisions which over the course of centuries led to empire, and it had many different phases. The early empire, which was in the Americas, is very different from, say, the late 19th century, which is, I think, the image that most people now have of it, perhaps because those British TV shows about the empire are still so popular, right? Where they're all in India marching, and you know, there's.
And also, have you noticed that every villain in every Hollywood movie is played by a British person, right? You know my theory about that. It's because
Yes.
you guys think that British Empire is evil, therefore, you know, even the German Nazis are all played by British actors, right?
Exactly.
Either they're cheap, or it's because of you're obsessed with the idea that British people are evil.
And of course, they have brilliant training as actors too. But there is something there. Though, of course, all the Romans are played by Brits too, you know.
Oh, really? Right.
Yes. But, you know, so on the one hand, there's the reality historically that the empire is not a planned, executed thing, you know. It happened, in some sense, you could say it happened organically. But that doesn't absolve anyone. There's also a system to it, right? And you're pointing out to some of the effects of the system, that the white nations could also be communicating and collaborating, as you might put it, in business, you know, on certain measures which are connected to imperial policy and imperial history. So, you know, the fact that the empire did not happen because one person or a group of people simply willed it, but happened through a series of events, doesn't absolve anyone and doesn't absolve us from looking hard at what its effects are, both on imperial populations as well as on the so-called mother countries.
Yeah, and I think you've touched upon something actually quietly profound. And I'm only just beginning to understand this now, is the level of how contradictory British Empire was. Because, yeah, it was conceived in the absence of mind, as the famous quote goes, I think John Seeley said. But also it was at other times planned, you know. It was heavily involved in slavery for long periods, dominated the slave trade sometimes, but then it fought slavery. At one time, it was really racist, you know, especially after the mutiny of 1857. Other times, you know, white people went to India, had brown wives, were encouraged to have brown wives. The East India Company would pay for your wedding, you know. And then another time, if you married a brown person, you would lose your job. It was considered so disgraceful. So that's one of the problems with British Empire. When talking about it, it was never one thing. And more than that, it was often opposite things.
Yes.
And how do you begin teaching that? Because it's much easier to talk about World War I and II, which is what we do in Britain. We just talk endlessly about the Tudors, Henry VIII, and World War I and World War II. Clear morality, clear beginning, you know, much easier than talking about, also, you know, we're the good guys, we win. Yes. Whereas British Empire, confused morality, no one agrees about when it began, when it ended. Some people say it never even began.
Yes. Yes,
you get people like Email Powell saying empire never happened. And you get into this crazy postmodern argument where the biggest empire in human history didn't happen.
Exactly.
So it's quite a difficult subject to talk about.
You actually talk about the varying views very eloquently, and it's a very nice summation of the varying views. The celebration of empire among some quarters today and throughout the imperial times also, but there was also always opposition to it. The opposition obviously was not the winning side. It was the recessive.
You could say they did win in the end.
In the end, took centuries, but perhaps yes. Maybe it's a tortoise and hare story. And the opposition, you know, some of the vocabulary that the opposition uses, which I had not quite seen until your book, you know, and this is a part of history that I had looked at before as a graduate student, but they use the kind of moral language that we would use today that wouldn't be out of place at Black Lives Matter, for example. So it really connects to our present day.
Yeah, I'm so glad you picked up on that, because, you know, we've now got an Indian Prime Minister, and during his leadership campaign, one of the many silly things he said was that, you know, he wanted to refer people who criticized Britain or did British history down, i.e. people like me. He wanted to refer us to PREVENT, which is the anti-terrorism agency. You know, so there's an idea in Britain now that if you want to be proudly British, you need to be proud of British Empire. But actually, as you picked up, it's a really deep British tradition to oppose empire. I would say you see that in America, but also, you know, you had it in people like Gladstone, the Prime Minister, 19th century. I think he was Prime Minister several times. He railed against empire.
Yes.
Like, dramatic language. You had Richard Cobden around the same time calling empire a career of spoliation and wrong. You know, Queen Victoria complaining about that skull that Lord Kitchener, you know, took from China. H.G. Wells, George Orwell, E.M. Forster, Churchill, I think, described Jallianwala Bagh as monstrous. You know, Gladstone saying that the way we looted Ethiopia was, you know, I can't remember, he said it was deeply, deeply wrong. And this happened at the time. There was constant opposition. And I think we forget that.
The interesting thing I've always thought is that the opposition also connected the terrible things that were happening overseas with injustices at home, including sort of straitjacketing views on gender, sexuality, you know. So you had all kinds of dissenters from, why am I forgetting? So several prominent novelists who themselves had what would be perhaps morally unacceptable lives as gay men in Britain. And there were also people who saw different shades of empire abroad. So they connected their own situation at home with the situation abroad. You actually have a very interesting first chapter, and I was not expecting it, to be honest. Or early chapter, is it the first or the second? No, it was the first one, Empire Day.
Oh,
And
yeah.
the ways in which, so you talk about a gentleman who, at the end of the Victorian era, wanted to really celebrate empire because he was afraid that its manly virtues were being forgotten and it would hurt Britain. And then you came up with a way of remembering empire in a completely different way, a new version of Empire Day. And I think that's relevant today because we're trying to figure out what to do with all this history, even in the US. You
Yeah,
have
what do we do
statues,
with
you
all
take the
this? Yeah.
racist statues out, do you leave them, would you put them in a museum? How do you come to terms with this pretty awful history, which still has a systemic effect on you?
Yeah, I do think America and Britain, actually India as well, and probably Hungary and Russia, are all having this crisis about imperial history, right? You got those cry, you know, what do we do about the statue of slavers like Colston or people like Robert Lee, right? What do we do about Churchill and Lincoln, these heroes who also were massively racist? And I think this is happening around the world. But I mean, my idea for Empire Day, a new version of it, is kind of tongue in cheek. But I just wanted to show how actually in the early 20th century, in the 19th century, empire was taught and it was actually relatively well understood. And now we've forgotten that. So we've forgotten how the empire shaped our language. Words like bungalow, these are words Americans use: bungalow, sandals, dinghy, pajamas. These are Indian words. Punch, I didn't realize it comes from bunch, you know, means five because it's got 5 ingredients in it. But also like all those corporations, you know, Shell, BP, British Petroleum, was originally Anglo-Persian. It's the way we got the oil out of the Middle East. The Scouts, you know, do you have the Scouts in America? I think you do, don't you?
Yes, we do, yes.
They
Well,
were originally going to be called the Imperial Scouts, and they were set up by a guy who, like Earl Meath, the founder of Empire Day, was worried that people were growing up, kids were growing up, not knowing about empire, and we're going to have this weak race of people who were not going to be able to continue the greatness of empire. But all sorts of things like fingerprinting, that was developed originally in India and then exported to Britain and presumably exported to America. A lot of police systems tried out in Ireland and then brought into Britain, spread around the world. But things like gin and tonic and all these cultural things, food, you know, curry, God, go on forever.
curry, tea.
Tea, that's not a small thing, is it? But like it's a smaller thing in America than it is here.
Well, except we did throw it into the ocean to claim our independence. So
We did. And actually, people forget, you know this, don't you? The tea that was thrown into the Boston Harbor was tea from the East India Company, probably tea from China, right?
exactly, it was tea from China, but brought by the British East India Company. There are many actually very interesting exchanges. The British gave away their rights to what became Bombay in return for a place called New Amsterdam. So they gave away the rights to Bombay and got New Amsterdam, which became New York City.
Yeah, insane. Actually, no, I think they gave away a tiny island called Run.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes, you're
it was a
right.
tiny
Absolutely.
island which was
In the
a
Banda
site.
Islands, yes.
That's right. It was a site of
Yes.
nutmeg, and
Nutmeg.
nutmeg then was hugely valuable. You could buy it and get it and run and sell it for 60 times the price in Europe.
Yes.
And
Good
they
correction.
decided they ended up getting New York and it swapped with the Dutch.
Exactly. And this, of course, the nutmeg, the Dutch exploited those islands so much they ended up killing the overwhelming majority of the population in the end. It's a very much like a Belgian Congo type story of the overexploitation of labor, which, as you also point out, part of the legacy of empire is the taste for sugar. And of course, sugar was immensely valuable and produced by slave trade and also part of empire. So
yeah, gosh, and that's the thing. I mean, I've been thinking so much in the years after the book. I'm learning things all the time. I didn't realize sugar was actually a spice. It's considered to be a spice. And I grew up, my relatives coming over from India, bringing back sugarcane with them. And because they grew it, my uncles grew it in India.
yes.
I didn't realize actually that was the crop that began the empire in the Caribbean, in Barbados. The fortunes they made on what they call the civilized island, huge amounts of money.
Yes.
And those families that made me, there's a guy called Richard Drax who's in our parliament. He's one of the richest MPs in parliament.
Yes.
His family, his ancestor, James Drax, was the guy who came up with plantation slavery in sugar in Barbados. And so the family still have the wealth. So then there's campaigns in Britain and in Barbados for him to pay reparations. And of
Yes.
course, he's resisting.
We should talk about reparations, but I want to turn to a couple of questions. We have two more questions that have come in. And for everyone else who's listening, I encourage you to put questions. I think I'd initially said in the chat, but that was my mistake. They're in the Q&A, and I am reading them. So let me just go in order with the questions here. Again, this is an anonymous question. Have you noticed a change in popular opinion about the empire in contemporary Britain over the last several years?
Yeah, I've seen a backlash. I think that I don't think there's been much knowledge to recently. There's been a huge backlash, cultivated largely partly by the right wing of the Conservative Party who are in government here. And so you had Boris Johnson, taking time out from the pandemic to say he was going to defend the statue of Winston Churchill with his last breath. You had another minister saying he was going to tie himself to the statue of Nelson in Trafalgar Square to stop the woke from tearing it down. The woke weren't going to tear that statue down, but it serves a purpose for them to create the idea that British history and British institutions are under attack from people like me and woke historians. And it's all part of a cultural war, which you guys have too. I don't know who got it first. It's like COVID. Who created it? Maybe it was created in a lab.
I don't, know where it started first, but what strikes me, as you talk about the backlash, and there's always a backlash, of course. I mean, in America after the Civil War, when, you had some arrangements that might have led to racial equality, there was a massive backlash, which led to a century of reversal that had to be, addressed in the 50s and 60s of the last century with the civil rights movement. There's always a backlash, but part of the intractable problem is this is so much a part of history that it's, in a way, easy to forget, and yet its persistent and very systematic effects are still there. So how does a modern population really address them? Getting rid of a statue is one thing, and maybe it's important, maybe it's not. People can have different views about that. But then how do you get to what do you really do about the systemic injustices, the economic inequalities that have been set in motion by a strong past event like that? And that's That's the part that I struggle with. And you actually, address that a little bit also, but it's hard to find an answer to that.
Yeah, to be honest, I had clear answers when I wrote the book, but a lot has happened since that makes me more depressed. One of the things that made me most depressed is in America, you can now got the banning of books, and the obvious answer is to all of this is to educate people and to encourage people to read history. But when books are being banned, when you've got newspapers and media companies publishing, fake history, giving platforms to people who are putting forward, versions of history which just didn't happen, it's quite depressing. And it feels like, from my point of view, it feels like a constant slog. But you just got to just hope that eventually truth will win. The problem is, the imperial historians in Britain have come to consensus. I think my book reflects that consensus. I basically base all of my conclusions on what the experts say. But now you've got groups of people who aren't experts saying, ignore the experts, listen to us. Same thing has happened with COVID, happened with Brexit, and it's happened with the US election. Same thing's happening with history. People saying, believe this fake history. I'm not sure we've got an answer to that in society. I mean, it's fueled by certain kinds of politicians and it's fueled by social media.
And of course, partly given rise perhaps also by the fact that experts on some key issues maybe missed something. So I think here in 2008, 2009, that great financial crisis, which actually caused a lot of suffering, 9 million people lost their homes. The experts had all been saying, deregulate the market, deregulate the market. That had at least been the consensus. And perhaps, it went too far and cost a lot of people their homes and therefore, a basic place in the world. So experts also, I think, proved themselves to have an underbelly of weakness, like great dragons, I suppose.
I think you see in India, I don't know how often you go back, but go back quite often?
Relatively often, yeah, actually.
I mean, you're seeing it with Modi, and he's putting forward a version of fake history himself. He's decolonizing India, claiming to be, but the way he talks about colonization, it doesn't just include the British, it includes the Mughal emperors, the Muslim. He calls them colonizers too, and so that's a very troubling thing to hear in modern secular India.
There is a complex history to that also, because there's also a version of left-wing history of India produced by Indian scholars post-independence, which also was blind to some things. And so there's a reaction to it too, which...
Yeah, you mean the Anglicized Congress?
Anglicized Congress, and many of them weren't overtly political, but they preferred to downplay certain parts. Perhaps it was a reaction to the partition of the subcontinent after the British Empire. But and there are parts that perhaps should have been more talked about. So I also think, just as I think reaction against experts has a context, I think the alternate versions of history also have a context. But anyway, let's not get... I also know it's getting to be close to 5 o'clock in the US and late for you. I don't want to keep our audience too long, but I do want to get to a couple of more questions, including a question from Rishi or Nikhil, which is here. And this is actually a very interesting question to me. Can you discuss how empire caused the colony countries to miss the bus on the Industrial Revolution? This is something that in Indian historical writing has been thought about a lot.
Well, I think there's an obvious answer to that. A lot of colonies weren't allowed to develop industrially, were they? You had the famous example of the textile industry in India, which was deindustrialized. Yeah. Basically, it was this, when Britain went there, they found a world-leading industry in textiles, and they decided that actually it would be better for them if they, got the cotton from America and span it in Manchester and forced that cotton upon Indians. And famously, a lot of the weavers, were destitute and were starving. So, a lot of imperial nostalgic people talk about how we gave the world railways and infrastructure like that. But who's to say that, these countries wouldn't have developed railways on their own, like Japan did, like China did, like most of the countries did. So it's a counterfactual thing where you can't say what life would have been like without empire.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of evidence that British Empire held back the development of a lot of colonies because it suited them for certain nations to be one crop economies. That it was good for them for Malaya to be producing rubber, and for India to be, Burma to be producing rubies, and India to be deindustrialized when it came to textiles and so on.
Of course, it's also been used as a racist, ethnocentric point of view that only white people were capable of having an industrial revolution or a scientific revolution. But I think there's a lot of evidence to the contrary now about.
And of course, the famous argument, of course, Eric Williams, is that the reason Britain managed to have an industrial revolution is that it was financed by slavery.
Exactly, and colonies. So that argument is also there. And in any case, knowledge was crossing the world, mathematics, science from India, the Arab world, to Europe and back. Listen, we're getting close to the end of our time. I just want to ask a couple of questions and then let everyone go. But one question I had, and this is about the book at large. I said at the beginning, you did not, yours is not really an ideological, you don't appear to be a card carrying this or a card carrying that. You are someone who's looking at the facts. And even when they're a little inconvenient, say about your own past and inheritance, you're willing to look at them. But you also at the same time don't talk about sort of normal ideological things people talk about when it comes to empire. You don't talk about capitalism in quite the same way. You don't talk about Christianity and the role that religion played, for example. You talk about racism, but white supremacy also as a kind of driving ideology that people would look at. Almost all of empire was justified as, say, slavery was, with the use of the Bible, and Christianity also, certainly capitalism, certainly white supremacy were also important ideological forces. Do you think about those things? Are those?
Yeah, I think you're right. You cannot write about empire without some ideology creeping in. I've got my biases, right? And the imperial historians I rely on probably have their biases. But, there are certain people who are now arguing that British Empire wasn't racist and arguing that, say, the Tasmanian genocide didn't happen. I mean, these are facts. I think you can argue, history is argument, but there are such things such as facts. History is argument based on hard evidence. And I would say I don't ignore hard evidence. And now we're in a world where history, a lot of people pushing history are now ignoring basic facts in an extension of the kind of almost Holocaust denial. I think we are getting genocide denial when it comes to the Tasmanian genocide. And it's happening to many other aspects of British imperial history. So yeah, I have got my own ideologies. They creep in certain ways, but I'm not going anywhere near as far as the people who are basically making stuff up.
You're reminding us of sort of the very sobering realities of the time we're living in. There is a lot of fake news. There's a lot of fake history. There's a lot of fakeism everywhere, and our ability to distinguish it is also more and more challenged. So does that inform your next works? So I want to end with, what are you doing next? Where do you go from here?
Yeah, I'm writing a sequel, which I'm nearly finished actually. It's about how British Empire shaped the planet, which won't be controversial at all. And I'm doing a kids version just because I think children should know something about British Empire, because I didn't know this stuff till my 40s, and it would have been quite useful to know. But then I really want to do something else, because it feels like writing about this subject, like you wake up every morning and you go to war, and it'd be nice to not feel like that for a while. So after these two books are over, I'm gonna, I don't know, maybe I'll write a novel or something. Maybe I'll get a job at Harvard Like you seem pretty relaxed.
Oh yes, the appearances can be quite deceptive. But I think you need to write something about the wine industry in France, or maybe maybe olive groves in Italy or something. That would be
You know
very.
what? I bet you olive groves in Italy are the bitchiest, most backfighting industry in the world, isn't it? You can't escape it, this stuff. But yeah,
Well,
maybe something like that.
and I think the realities of migrant labor and the way it is deployed to make all the products that so many of the products that many of us use and cherish all over
Actually,
the
the
world.
Parmesan cheese in Italy, at the moment, is a lot of it's made by Sikhs.
Oh, I did
Because
not know that.
we are dairy farmers in the Punjab, as well as being soldiers. And they're going to Italy to make the Parmesan cheese.
Oh, very. I know that a lot of the pizzerias in Italy are now being run by South Asians
Oh, really?
as immigrants. So,
Well, we've got to keep up our reputation for having type 2 diabetes. Maybe that's one way.
exactly. Well, Sathnam, it's really a delight to be speaking with you. Please come and visit us. I want to thank our listeners also for staying with us and for the very interesting questions. And again, before I go off, I want to thank Harvard Bookstore and want to iterate. It really is an institution that has enriched life here, and I'm very delighted to be part of it.
Thank you, Hitesh.
Thank you, Hitesh. Thank you, Sathnam, particularly for warm words about the bookstore, but also just for that great conversation. That was so interesting to listen to. And thank you to everyone out there in virtual land for spending your late afternoon, early evening, or late night, depending where you are with us. You can learn more about and purchase Empireland at harvard.com or via the link in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a great night, keep reading, and please be well. Thank you all. Good night.